So far, we've just been using some procedural noise for the animation on the tentacles of these creatures, so now let's do some nicer simulations of these tentacles with Vellum. And we have a few different options for simulation types to create this deformation in Vellum. We could simulate this as curves, as cloth, or as soft bodies, and we'll take a quick look at each of those options. So I've created a Vellum Tentacles geometry object, and let's dive inside here, and let's merge in the rest position of the creature. So create an object merge, and we'll point this to object/creature/out-creature, and that'll bring in this creature at the rest position here. And we're just going to simulate these tentacles in the rest position here, and then tell this animation to follow the path deformations that we've already set up. You could potentially animate these tentacles on the creatures after they're already flying through space, but that can be a lot more difficult to get nice simulation behavior. Anytime we can simulate something in the rest position, the sim is going to be much easier to control and much more predictable, and just all around easier to work with than simulating something as it's flying through space. So first of all, we can isolate the areas that we're interested in. So let's do a selection and click on this icon here to do a selection based on the path attribute. Make sure you're selecting primitives. And let's select the tentacles and all the ridges here. And I suppose we could also select this root section that the tentacles are attaching to as well. And with those selected, let's drop in a blast stop and flip that to delete non-selected to just isolate the sections that we've picked. Now you could simulate this geometry directly, but it's often better to create a proxy mesh that we're going to simulate and then use that proxy mesh to deform the final mesh. And you could potentially just use these tubes directly here, those cylinders that are traveling through those tentacle ridges, and these could potentially be fine as simulation objects, but in cases where you don't already have an object that has some nice topology and that would be good to simulate, sometimes it's helpful to do some VDB meshing to create a decent proxy object. So let's drop in a VDB from polygons and display that, and this looks like it gives us a reasonable amount of detail there. If you don't actually want a ton of detail in all of these ridges and everything, perhaps you want to just simulate a smoother tube for some more consistent behavior, we could try to smooth that out a bit. A couple different ways. You could use the VDB smooth SDF operation, and this will certainly smooth that out quite a bit. More iterations yields more smoothing. And it's always good to template view our original geometry to see how closely we're matching to it. So in this case, it looks like we're matching pretty well to the original geometry, even after doing 10 iterations of this VDB smooth. So that's looking pretty good. And it can also be helpful to do a VDB reshape. So on that VDB reshape, that will by default dilate it so it expands that SDF a bit. And if we increase this a bit more to do a few voxels instead, and then do an additional reshape after that to erode it by a similar amount. So set the second VDB reshape to erode, and I'll set that to the same value of 3. It looks like this isn't too much different from what we're getting with just the VDB smooth. Yeah, in this case it's pretty similar, but these are two different ways that you can smooth out your VDB meshing. And now once we have a reasonable proxy volume here, we can convert this to polygons. So I'll drop in a convert VDB and perhaps get rid of the template view of the original geometry. And on this convert VDB, let's set the convert to polygons. And this is quite high resolution. And sure, you could change the resolution of this by simply changing the resolution of your VDBs, but that will also change how the smooth and reshape behaviors work. So if you're already liking the shapes you're getting from your smooth and your reshape, you might not want to mess with that VDB resolution. And this would be a pretty high resolution mesh to simulate directly. And especially for the type of effect we're going for here, we don't need nearly that much resolution. So we can drop in a remesh after this. And by default, that remesh is still pretty high res, so we can go much larger with this target size here to give ourselves a more lightweight proxy mesh. So now increasing this remesh target size to 0.9 gives us a much lower resolution mesh here. And this doesn't look very nice. If we were going to use this for the actual tentacles and render this, it wouldn't look very good. But for simulation purposes, something like this can work just fine to simulate, and then we can just deform the original render mesh tentacles with this lower res mesh. So now that we have this proxy mesh here, let's set up a portion of this that's going to get pinned in place. Because if we just simulate the whole thing, then this is just going to blow away through space, and we want this section on the roots of the tentacles to just be pinned in place. So there are various ways we could do this. Let's perhaps do another selection from our original creature rest pose here. So I'll display that once again, this object merged directly. And I'll do another selection based on the path attribute and select just the ridges here. And I suppose we could also grab the ends as well and hit delete once again to do a blast on those pieces, flip it to non-selected, and I'm going to do another VDB from polygon on just these pieces here. And then for this VDB from polygons, we don't necessarily want to get a super accurate representation of the surface, so we can go lower resolution with this if we want to. I'll turn the voxel size up a bit to 0.2. And then we can expand this as well with a VDB reshape SDF. And it looks like this SDF here is large enough that this should include all of the regions that we need to make as active simulated portions of the mesh. So let's drop in a group SOP, place this after the remeshed sim mesh tentacles, like so. Let's connect that tentacle area volume to the second input of the group. Group type is points, turn off the base group, turn on bounding regions. Bounding type is bounding object. Or actually, instead of using bounding object, let's select bounding volume, because this also gives us the option to invert this bounding region, which in this case is what we want. We're not really looking to group the tentacle areas here. We actually want the areas that are not in this actively simulated tentacle region. So let's turn on this invert on that bounding region. So that gives us just this main area over here that's going to get pinned in place. And then for this group name, I'm just going to call this pin. And now let's take a look at simulating this as a cloth object. So if you hit tab and type vellum configure, we have a few different presets for different types of deformable vellum objects here. Let's take a look at the cloth option first. So select vellum configure cloth and drop this in after the pin. And then on our vellum cloth here, we have to set the pin group down in this pin to animation section here. So on that vellum constraints for the vellum cloth here, under pin points, select that pin group we've created. It doesn't really matter if you select match animation in this case because this input object isn't animated at all, so we don't really need to select that. But if you want to follow animation, then you would need to use that. And then if we go through the vellum constraints options here, we have an option for density and thickness. For this sort of heavy tentacle simulation, I think I'm going to go with a slightly higher density as a starting point. So we can try turning this up quite a bit. I'll try something like 5 to make these points quite dense here. And then for the collision thickness, it can be helpful to visualize the thickness here. And if we zoom in, you can see the thickness that it's using for the internal collisions. If we turn up this edge length scale, you can see it's going to give us much thicker collisions and much larger enforced spacing in there, which can be potentially useful in some cases, but can lead to gaps where collisions are happening. In this case, I'm just going to try leaving the collision edge length scale at its default value. And then if we scroll through some more of the options on the vellum cloth here, I'm not going to go into incredible detail on every single option that we could possibly set on our vellum objects here. But to briefly go through some of these options, we have two different types of drag. The normal drag here, and these give you little hints about what each of them do if you hover over them. The normal drag will push the object along its normal whenever it's in motion, or when wind forces are applied to it. So if we had a flag perhaps, it's this normal drag here that would force a flag to kind of wave back and forth based on any wind force applied. The tangent drag will be essentially the direction along the surface instead of normal to it, and this drag will affect how easily this object will perhaps slice through the air. And if you want a polygon that's traveling through space to be slowed down, then you'll use some more tangent drag to control that. The pin to animation here, we've briefly talked about a little bit in terms of setting this pin group in order to make the roots of these tentacles just pinned to their current positions. We're always just going to root the bases of the tentacles in place here, so permanent is totally fine. And then scrolling down a bit more, the stretch stiffness is going to just enforce the amount of stretch that's allowed between these vellum points here. The damping ratio can be helpful if things are behaving a bit too energetically and you want to kind of smooth out the motion of these constraints. And if you hover over it, it says it does this by, quote, bleeding energy while evaluating the constraint. The rest length scale is interesting. In some cases, you can create some interesting effects by forcing expansion or contraction of the mesh by scaling its rest length. We don't need to mess with that in this case, but you can do some interesting things with that. We also have a separate compression stiffness that prevents the points from coming together in addition to preventing them from spreading apart with stretch. The stiffness drop-off is kind of interesting. I don't think I've ever messed with this one at all in my simulations, but this allows you to increase or decrease the stiffness of the constraints as they stretch out from their rest length. That's controlled by this increasing or decreasing drop down here. So once things get stretched out, that can allow them to remain a little bit more stretched out and not try as hard to restore their initial rest length position. Or inversely, if that's increasing, then the more these things get stretched out, the more forcefully they're going to try to achieve their original rest length. But that's another one that we don't really need to worry about. If we scroll down some more, the bend stiffness is probably a bit self-explanatory as well. If you crank that up, we're going to have much stiffer tentacles here. The rest angle scale is kind of similar to the rest length scale, but it's probably less often used than rest length is, because you can imagine cases where you may want to expand or contract the edge length of a mesh for various types of deformable sims, and I have used that in the past. I don't believe I've ever run into any reason to do this rest angle scale thing. I'm sure there are some interesting use cases, but I don't think I've had to mess with that one at all. There is this interesting option here if you hover over it. It mentions that setting it to 0 will treat the original configuration as a flat sheet. So yeah, scaling that rest angle all the way down to 0 will try to achieve complete flatness with all of these angles between the polygons here. So who knows, that could be potentially helpful, but once again, it's not something we care about for these tentacles. And similar to the stretch, we also have a bend stiffness drop-off that allows us to increase or decrease those bend constraint strengths depending on how much it's deviated from its rest angle. Once again, we don't really need that in this case either. These tentacles will be a bit more of a straightforward setup than that. And I'm actually going to start by leaving all of these settings at their defaults. So now to simulate this cloth, let's drop in a vellum solver and connect the first and second outputs of our vellum cloth to the first and second inputs of the vellum solver, which are looking for the vellum geometry and then the vellum constraints. And then on this vellum solver, we don't actually want to use any gravity, so on the forces tab, let's set the gravity to 0. And then we could start using this wind drag to blow some wind through this tentacle cloth here. So let's zoom out a bit and try increasing the wind to 50 in the X direction. And now if we do a flip book of this wind blowing through our vellum cloth, you can see we kind of have some vaguely interesting motion happening in here. It's just sort of wobbling pretty straight along that wind direction. And maybe if we start playing around with a normal drag or something, we could get some more interesting shapes. But I much prefer using something like a pop wind to give ourselves more interesting shapes in this wind behavior. So let's stop that, and we'll turn off our wind entirely, set that to 0 and or turn off that check. And then let's dive inside the vellum solver, and we're going to wire in a pop wind into this null that says force output here. And this vellum solver wrapper is quite convenient. If you look up at our navigation hierarchy bar here, you can see inside the vellum solver there's actually a DOP.NET here, and when we dive inside this vellum solver, we're actually diving inside a couple levels to this editable section inside this vellum solver wrapper. So on our little navigation bar here, if you click up to the DOP.NET, you can see that this has already created the basic setup for a vellum sim for us, and none of this stuff is editable unless we allow the editing of contents on this vellum solver wrapper manually. But the whole point of the vellum solver wrapper is that we generally don't need to do that because it's set up all of the important things for us already, and it creates this forces subnet that actually is editable, and we can put additional influences to our simulation in there. So back at the SOP level for our vellum tentacles, this vellum solver knows that when we dive inside, we're actually diving into that forces subnet, and then we can put in whatever normal DOP forces we want to. So in this case, we've added a pop wind. Similar to before, let's give this some wind velocity in the X direction. Maybe I'll try a little bit less. Let's do 35. And I'm going to give this some pretty aggressive noise as well. Let's try an amplitude of 60, swirl size of 8. And we don't need a ton of detail in this turbulence noise we're adding. We want some pretty broad, large, swirly shapes in this noise. So I'm going to turn down the turbulence levels from 3 to 2. And for things like the swirl size, I'm not just totally guessing at this just out of nowhere. Oftentimes I will use some reference geometry in my scene to help decide on the swirl size. So going back up to SOPs, it can be quite helpful to just create a box or a sphere of a certain size. And let's control template view that to make that solid. And we'll take a look at how big that is in relation to these tentacles. And this 1 unit size box is pretty small in size compared to our tentacles here. So then we can increase the size of this box to see what size of noise features we want to see in our pop wind. So when we turn this up to a number like 8, which is what I've used in the pop wind there, you can see that this size is approximately how large the broadest features of our pop wind will be. And this is kind of an interesting starting point because a larger size like this will hopefully push some of our tentacles into some big undulating motions. And diving back inside the Vellum solver, you can see this turbulence setting of 2 here means we won't only get that swirl size of 0.8, we'll have a second smaller layer of turbulence also layered in for some additional detail. And if you find that this turbulence noise is evolving too quickly or too slowly, because this is an animated turbulence noise, you can change the pulse length here to determine the speed of that turbulence evolution. I'll just leave it as it is for now. Let's go back up to SOPs, turn off our box display, and then see what this cloth looks like with this pop wind instead of just the standard Vellum wind. So now if we take a flipbook at this version of the sim, you can see we're getting some kind of crazy results here, but it's much more interesting in terms of these undulating motions flowing through these tentacles here. We're getting some wind motion from that directional force applied in that pop wind, and we're also getting these kind of evolving turbulent shapes through this as well. And these cloth tentacles are getting fairly stretched out. They're not really doing a good job of preserving their volume at all, and they're actually not trying to preserve the volume within the tentacles. These cloth meshes are really only interested in, enforcing the compression and stretch and the bend. They're not really doing anything to do any sort of volume preservation within the tentacles. See, if we dive through there, it gets really skinny really quick. And if we want to do more volume preservation, then we want to use some soft bodies for this instead. And there are some things we could do to calm this down as well. And one of those things is not necessarily the most obvious setting ever. On the Vellum solver here, if we go to the Advanced tab, there's this integration option here. And I believe Side Effects probably explains this a bit better and more technically in their masterclasses on Vellum. But essentially, if you mouse over on this, this tells you that the second order integration will preserve more energy in the system. And with these tentacles, I want a slightly more calm motion from them. So the goal here is not really to preserve energy. I'm not really worried about losing energy in the system. So in this particular case, I found myself using the first order integration as well, since I'm not so concerned about preserving all this energetic behavior. And you could potentially explore some of the other options here. I didn't find them necessary at all for these tentacles. Although under the motion drop down here, I believe I turned down the max acceleration a little bit just to reduce the sudden changes in velocity and the mesh. And now flipbooking this new simulation with first order integration and some max acceleration set, you can see that this is looking a bit more calm than the second order integration with the higher max acceleration. You can see the version on the left is a little bit more energetic than the version on the right. And it depends on what you're looking for in the simulation. In some cases, the version on the left may be what you want, but in this case, I wanted something a little bit more ethereal, magical, just a softer look to these tentacles. So this first order integration and limited max acceleration I found quite helpful in achieving the look that I was going for. And of course, as I mentioned before, these tentacles are not doing anything to preserve volume at this point. And if we want to preserve volume in the tentacles, then we're going to have to look at doing a soft body sim instead of just a cloth simulation, and we'll take a look at the soft body version in the next video.